The fires broke out before most of Tel Aviv had opened its eyes. Not one fire, not a single strike point that officials could photograph, contain, and shape into a manageable story. Fires, plural, erupting at the same moment across districts so far apart that crews responding to one couldn't get to the next before that one was already burning. And somewhere inside a government building that has gone completely quiet this morning, a group of people who spent 4 weeks assuring 4 million civilians that the system would hold are sitting with the knowledge that it didn't. And they have no words for that, because there are no words for that. Here is what you need to understand. This did not begin this morning. What you're watching right now on those live feeds out of Tel Aviv, the columns of smoke, the broken broadcasts, the civil defense alerts with warning times so short they are functionally meaningless, this is the final frame of a sequence that started the first time Iran fired a single FO-3 into Israeli airspace and simply watched what followed. Not to cause destruction, to observe what happened. That distinction carries more weight than anything else I will say today. In nearly every analysis you will come across about this morning's barrage has already missed it, because most analysis starts with the weapon and moves forward. I'm going to start with the question Iran was actually asking. The question was not whether Iran could hit Tel Aviv. Iran had answered that long before February. The real question was this: at exactly what moment would Israel's interceptor stockpile be depleted enough and the civilian population's confidence in the system be high enough that a sustained hypersonic barrage would simultaneously produce maximum physical destruction and maximum political collapse? That is not a military question. It is a calculation. A cold, unhurried, methodical calculation that Iran has been running since the first FO-3 test confirmed that Israel's defensive architecture had no reliable answer to it. And this morning, that calculation was complete. The fires are the answer. What you're watching is not Iran's firepower overwhelming Israel's defenses in a direct confrontation. It is the result of Iran waiting. Stay with me, because what I'm about to walk through is going to reframe every single event in this conflict going back to February 28th. Let's start with what most people believe they already understand, because you need to see the standard interpretation clearly before you can recognize what it leaves out. The conventional reading goes like this: Iran has been escalating steadily. Israel's layered system, Iron Dome for short range, David's Sling for medium-range ballistic threats, Arrow for high-altitude long-range incoming, has been absorbing that pressure at enormous cost in interceptors, but largely holding. The system was always going to wear down under sustained pressure. Interceptor stockpiles deplete faster than they are replenished during an active conflict. This was known. This was modeled. The question was always how long the system could function before the depletion curve crossed the incoming threat volume and uncontested strikes became inevitable. The FO-3, in the conventional reading, is the weapon that accelerated that crossing point, a hypersonic glide vehicle that the existing layered architecture was never built to reliably defeat, fast enough to compress the intercept window to seconds, maneuverable enough in its terminal phase to defeat the fire control solutions that work against standard ballistic reentry vehicles. When Iran began mixing FO-3 rounds into its conventional salvos, the standard red says it was using them as penetration tools, tip-of-the-spear rounds engineered to drain the upper-tier interceptors that would otherwise engage the larger ballistic package arriving behind them. And this morning, the conventional reading continues, Iran shifted from using the FO-3 as a penetration instrument to deploying it as the primary strike package, a sustained sequential barrage designed to hold the residual defensive system in continuous engagement until its remaining interceptor capacity was gone. The system, already depleted, got pushed past the threshold where it could protect a city. Tel Aviv burned. That is the conventional read. Every technical detail in it is accurate, and it is missing the most important thing. Because the conventional read treats the FO-3 escalation as a military decision made when Iran calculated that the stockpile was low enough to make a sustained barrage viable. A decision based on Iran's own intelligence estimate of Israeli interceptor levels, degraded radar coverage, compressed warning timelines. A military planner examining a target, reviewing an asset inventory, deciding the numbers were favorable. But here is exactly what that framing leaves out. Iran did not have to estimate Israel's interceptor stockpile levels. Israel told them, not directly, not through some intercepted classified transmission, through something far more dependable, far more consistent, and far more precise than any intelligence operation. 4 weeks of public statements by Israeli officials reassuring their own civilians. Every time an Israeli official appeared on camera and told 4 million people in Tel Aviv that the layered defense was holding, that interception rates remained strong, that the population was protected, that statement was simultaneously meant for a domestic audience and processed as a data point by Iranian analysts running a model built around one question. Does Israel's own government believe its system is still functioning? A government that knows its interceptor inventory is critically low does not keep making public assurances about system effectiveness. It begins preparing its people for a different reality. The fact that Israeli officials were still issuing those assurances as recently as 72 hours ago told Iranian analysts something more precise than satellite imagery ever could. It told them that the Israeli government still believed the system could hold, which meant the stockpile, while degraded, had not yet crossed the threshold that would force a change in the official narrative. And the moment that threshold crossing became detectable, not in a classified report, but in a subtle but measurable shift in the language Israeli officials used to describe the system's protective capacity, Iran would know the window had arrived. Not estimated, not modeled with uncertainty ranges. Known. Because governments under this kind of sustained pressure reveal the condition of their defenses through the specific words they reach for when speaking to their own people. Iranian analysts were reading those words every single day since February 28th. The conventional read says Iran launched the sustained barrage when it calculated the stockpile was sufficiently low. The real story is colder than that. Iran fired when Israel's own officials told them it was time. And if that is correct, and I believe it is, then this morning's barrage was not the moment Iran's military capability broke through Israel's defenses. It was the moment Iran finished reading the Israeli government's own public statements and concluded that the answer was already written inside them. That is the story beneath the visible story, and it gets harder to sit with from here. I want to be deliberate here because what I am about to describe risks sounding too clean, too structured, as though I am mapping a tidy logic onto events that were chaotic, fast-moving, and shaped by variables no one fully controlled. But the pattern exists, and once you see it, it does not go away. Go back to the first F-03 Iran ever fired into Israeli airspace, a single round folded into a larger conventional salvo, officially described, including by Israeli defense sources, as a penetration vehicle. A tip-of-the-spear round designed to consume upper-tier interceptors before the ballistic package behind it arrived. That description is accurate. It is also incomplete. Because a single F-03 fired into a functioning multi-layered defensive architecture does not only carve a penetration corridor. It generates data. Specifically, it produces observable information about how the defensive system responds to a hypersonic glide vehicle under real engagement conditions. Which tier of the layered system activates, how many interceptors are committed against the incoming round, whether the engagement succeeds or whether the round gets through, and critically, how long the post-engagement recovery window is before the system returns to full operational readiness. Every one of those data points is observable from outside the system, some from satellite imagery of launch signatures, some from signals intelligence on fire control communications, some from publicly reported outcomes. Because in the early weeks of this conflict, successful interceptions were something the Israeli government wanted its population to hear about. Iran was running a diagnostic, not primarily to inflict damage with those early rounds, to measure the system's response characteristics under real engagement conditions with a real stockpile against a real hypersonic threat. And here is the counterintuitive thing that changes the entire picture. The single most valuable data point in that diagnostic was not the rounds that got through. It was the rounds that were successfully intercepted. Sit with that for a moment. When Israel successfully intercepted a F-03 round, it had to spend interceptors to do it. It had to activate specific tiers of its layered architecture. It had to reveal, through the engagement signature, something about the remaining capacity within those tiers. A system with deep reserves responds to a hypersonic threat differently than a system running low. The engagement geometry, the number of interceptors committed per incoming round, the decision to engage early or late in the terminal approach. These are all observable. Every successful Israeli interception was simultaneously a defensive achievement and a piece of intelligence handed to Iran. Israel stopped the missile. Iran learned precisely what it cost them to stop it. Run that diagnostic across 4 weeks of escalating salvos, progressively larger packages, progressively more F-03 rounds folded in. By the time you reach week 4, Iranian analysts operating a depletion model built on real engagement data have a far more exact picture of the remaining interceptor inventory over Tel Aviv than any satellite survey of storage facilities could provide. The diagnostic did not simply tell Iran the system was deteriorating. It told them the rate of deterioration. And the rate of deterioration told them, within a calculable window, when the stockpile would fall to the level where a sustained F-03 barrage would exhaust the remaining capacity before Tel Aviv's emergency infrastructure could absorb the accumulating impact points. This morning, that window opened. Now here is the shift I think most people watching this conflict have not yet made. We have been reading this as a story about Iran's offensive capability, the F-03, its hypersonic speed, its maneuvering terminal profile, the defensive architecture's structural inability to reliably intercept it. A story about a weapon Israel's system could not stop. That is not the story. It is a story about information, about who held better information about the state of Israel's defenses, the Israeli public The Israeli government managing the public narrative, or the Iranian analysts who spent 4 weeks building a precise depletion model from real engagement data that the Israeli government's own interception announcements were partially supplying. Iran did not overwhelm Israel's defenses with superior firepower this morning. Iran waited until it knew, with the precision that 4 weeks of diagnostic engagement data can provide, exactly what remained. And then it fired exactly enough rounds at exactly the right intervals to exhaust what was left before the barrage ended. That is not a military operation in the conventional sense. That is the closing move of a very long, very patient information campaign. And if that is what happened, and the engagement pattern strongly suggests it is, then the most consequential failure in this conflict was not the interceptor stockpile running out. It was the information asymmetry that allowed Iran to know it was running out before Israel's own public did. Nobody is discussing what comes next. I mean that literally. I have read every major defense analysis published in the last 72 hours. This factor appears in none of them, not in the Israeli press, not in the American assessment circulated through the usual channels, not in the European security analysis that tends to surface what others miss. The factor is this: the civil defense warning system, not the weapons, not the interceptors, the warning system. The mechanism that tells 4 million people in Tel Aviv they have a certain number of seconds to reach shelter before a missile arrives. Stay with me here, because this is where the human cost of this morning becomes legible. The FO3's hypersonic terminal phase compresses the warning window to seconds. This is widely reported and accurately described. What is not being discussed is what that compression does to the civil defense warning system specifically, and what the warning system's degraded performance does to the data that Israeli officials have been drawing on to justify their public assurances about protective capacity. The Israeli civil defense model was built around a 90-second warning standard. That standard was not chosen arbitrarily. It was calculated from the time required for a civilian in Tel Aviv to receive a siren alert, recognize it as genuine, move from wherever they are to a designated shelter point, and reach a protected position before impact. 90 seconds is tight. It demands immediate movement. But it was achievable in the threat environment the model was designed for. The FO3 does not give 90 seconds. It gives somewhere between 8 and 20 seconds, depending on the flight profile and the radar detection geometry on any given engagement. 8 to 20 seconds is not enough time to reach a shelter. It is barely enough time to register that an alert has sounded. And here is the part that nobody is talking about. When warning time collapses below the threshold where sheltering is physically achievable, civilian behavior in response to alerts changes. Not because people have stopped caring about survival, because the rational calculation shifts. Whether a 12-second warning is worth acting on, whether sprinting toward a shelter you cannot reach before impact is more dangerous than remaining where you are. That calculation shifts in ways the civil defense coordination model was never designed to handle. People stop moving, or they move in patterns the model did not anticipate. Either way, the casualty profile from an impact arriving with 12 seconds of warning into a non-sheltered civilian population is categorically different from the profile the emergency response infrastructure was built to absorb. The hospitals receiving casualties from this morning's barrage are not receiving the casualty profile their emergency departments prepared for. They are receiving something heavier, more immediate, more concentrated. Because the warning times that were supposed to give civilians the window to reach safety were too short to act on. And that gap affected the mass casualty numbers in ways that are only now becoming visible. And here is where it connects directly back to the information story. The Israeli government's public assurances about system effectiveness were built in part on the civilian shelter compliance rates that the 90-second warning standard made possible. When officials said the system was protecting the population, part of what made that claim defensible was that the warning architecture was giving people enough time to protect themselves even when interceptors failed. Once the FO3 compressed warning times below the shelter threshold, that part of the assurance became operationally false. The system was no longer providing meaningful protection through warning time, even when it was still providing partial protection through interception. But the public assurance did not change, because changing it would have required admitting that the warning architecture had been functionally defeated by the hypersonic threat profile, and that admission would have produced exactly the kind of civilian panic that a government managing a 4-week conflict at this intensity cannot absorb. So the assurance held. The warning times stayed short. The civilian population kept being told the system was protecting them at the precise moment when one of the two mechanisms through which the system protected them had already been rendered obsolete by the weapon's flight profile. Iran knew this. Iranian analysts watching the civil defense guidance coming out of Tel Aviv over the preceding 3 weeks could see the gap between the official warning time messaging and the physical reality of what 12 seconds of warning into a non-sheltered civilian population actually produces. That gap was another data point in the diagnostic. It meant that when the barrage came, its human cost would exceed the Israeli government's own models, because those models were built on shelter compliance rates that warning time compression had already made obsolete. The casualty figures emerging from Tel Aviv this morning are not a surprise to the people who built this operation. They are the output of a calculation that was completed long before the first round was fired. Nobody's talking about this. They should be.